Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections listeners. Today I have a special solo episode to tell you about our 3-year podcast anniversary. 3 years ago, I started the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. It was something I had been thinking about for a long time. And as an avid podcast listener myself, I felt I had heard enough podcasts to create my own. It seemed to me there was a gap between podcasts about leadership and podcasts about culture, and I wanted to bridge the gap with interviews that touched on both. As you know, I have a keen interest on how leadership is built and perceived through the ecosystems of personality, family, interpersonal, cultural, racial belief, and professional dynamics. It was not hard to find people to interview, and over time, the podcast itself has brought in new requests for interviews currently on a weekly basis. You may not know this, but it takes a lot of time and a certain investment to create and produce a podcast. You need to find guests, get equipment, collect guest data, organize it, build a web page, social media, post on a regular schedule. It takes an editor for sound quality, someone to write the show notes, and then you have to let people know about it to build up your listeners. Podcasts are not get-rich-quick schemes. Podcasters are in the game for the long haul. So why do I do it? Well, here's my why. Culture and Leadership Connections podcast answers these 3 fundamental questions for me. Number 1, how can I understand people through all the lenses of their diversity? Number 2, what would help others feel the experiences of their fellow human beings more deeply? And number 3, who needs to be broadcast to the world so that we can have a more just and equitable world? No matter what else I accomplish or fail at in my life, if I die tomorrow, I know that my legacy can be found in its relationship to uplifting what is noble and good in human beings. And the podcast is a tangible record of that life work. There is a beautiful story about the African-American jazz singer Ella Fitzgerald and the famous actress Marilyn Monroe. Ella Fitzgerald was having a hard time getting gigs because the venue owners wouldn't host a Black singer. So Marilyn Monroe told one of the key venue owners that she would be in the front row every single night for 10 nights if they let Ella Fitzgerald sing. This was a promise she held up, and it was the first big break for Ella Fitzgerald to cut through the soul-crushing and career-limiting racism that surrounded her constantly. After that, many other venues actively sought her out, and she became known as the huge jazz star that she was put on earth to be. Marilyn Monroe was not the reason for Ella Fitzgerald's success. Ella was the reason for that. But Marilyn did something that was in her power to help others see what the blight of racism was blinding them to. And once they heard Ella's beautiful voice and experienced the sheer joy of her magnificent performances, they were hooked for life. There is a wonderful photo of Ella and Marilyn sitting next to each other and laughing like crazy over a shared joke. You can see the love between them and feel their mutual admiration. That's why I do this podcast. I want to be a conduit for people to be seen in all the glory of their capacity, enjoyed for who they are, and heard in the full-throated song of their own voice. The other reason I host this podcast is because, if money were no object, I would spend all my time interviewing people and promoting them. I would just do it a lot more than I do now. I am not only insatiably curious, but I am an insatiable connector. Nothing makes me happier than learning something more deeply or connecting someone to a personal resource or to an inner gem they already have but couldn't previously see. As a result of this constant and passionate effort, Culture and Leadership Connections has attracted a wide audience who wants to hear from people they would normally never meet in an intimate and personal way. When I interview others, I seek to connect with their hearts, minds, and souls in ways that help them feel appreciated and show them the mirror of their own awesomeness. My insatiable curiosity sometimes leads me to challenge or prod a guest. Even so, I'm conscious of the importance of respect, safety, and kindness. When I invite guests to be vulnerable in this space, I want to ensure their trust is not betrayed. It is common for guests to tell me that they feel their interview was a cathartic experience, or that they saw themselves in deeper and more appreciative ways. Some people have even said it felt like therapy to have an interview on the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. I hope that was good. Some of our guests have been very famous. Others should be. All of them need to be heard. Now that I've bared my podcast soul, here are a few stats. Culture and Leadership Connections has 35 episodes that went live over the 3 years, and there are another 10 already recorded and ready to be published. For 2 years, we published once a month. Now we publish twice a month. We have reached the first podcast milestone of 2,500 plus downloads. There have been equal numbers of men and women interviewed, and of those already published interviews, 10 have been immigrants, 12 visible minority, 2 Indigenous, and 3 under age 30. Upcoming, we have 2 LGBTQ guests, 3 immigrant, 2 visible minority, and that is just taking us to the end of December. If you're doing the math, you might see that there is some category overlap. One guest might fit into several so-called categories. I have interviewed people from 45 different professions, all the world religions, or no religion. Guests have come from multiple industries, ranging from professional football, manufacturing plant managers, and clinical neurologists to food store owners, investors, authors, artists, songwriters, consultants, truck drivers, and hypnotists. I continue to seek out more guests who have shown leadership in their lives and professions, and I receive a steady stream of unsolicited interview guest requests, which leads me to my final comments on this 3-year podcast anniversary. To celebrate, I'm hosting a Zoom podcast party on October 15th at 6 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. The party will feature some past and some upcoming guests who will pitch their episode, offer gifts, and generally delight and entertain you. We have some prizes to give away to people who are there live, and a special surprise that involves both music and comedy. More about that later. You do not want to miss out on this milestone event, and yes, it is absolutely free. You may be wondering, well, what's in it for me personally to host this podcast party? Well, here is my completely exposed naked agenda. Help me get this podcast up to 5,000 plus downloads. Here are 4 actions you can take that would really make a difference to help me reach this goal and won't cost you a penny. Number 1, share the podcast with a friend every day for 5 days. Number 2, register for the podcast party. Number 3, encourage those 5 friends that you shared the podcast with to register for the podcast party too. Number 4, email me a testimonial about an episode you particularly liked, or post your review on our Facebook Culture and Leadership Connections podcast page. If every single one of our listeners does all 4 of these actions, we will have way more than 12,000 downloads by the end of the party. And if you do just one, it will still really help me reach the milestone goal. You can say thank you for the hundreds of hours of labor of love to produce the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by just sharing the podcast and coming to the party. Registration information is on our shiftworkplace.com upcoming events and webinars page. It is shiftworkplace.com/upcoming free webinars. That's shiftworkplace.com/upcoming free webinars, and look for podcast party on October 15th. I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the party, and may Culture and Leadership Connections continue to guide and inspire your day.